session number 37 in our series of Mark, this time looking at Mark 8, verses 14 through 22. And the title, The 12 Dull Disciples. We're going to be looking at them while they're on their journey back to the east side of the river. And so, funny thing happened on the way across the Sea of Galilee. Mark 8:14. And they had forgotten to take bread. Now remember, it wasn't long ago they could have walked off with 7 great baskets of food, but evidently they did not. Or if they did take it with them, they must have left it with the Pharisees and Dalmutha. And it continues in 8:14, and they did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. Well, let's see. They returned from their Gentile hiatus to Dalmutan. They engaged the Pharisees in an argument. They turned around and said, I've had it with you guys, and they head to Bethsaida, Julia, on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, if they had kept a basket of leftovers from the feeding of the 4,000, they wouldn't have had time to dispose of it anywhere, I don't think. So evidently they either did not keep any of the leftovers or they dumped it in Magadan or, Dalnutha, however we say it. But it seems reasonable. There I go with that problem of speaking again. It seems reasonable that it was divided up among the 4,000 for their trip home. But that left them without much of anything to eat. Who blew it? Who was responsible? You can bet that is going to be an issue they'll raise between themselves. So, when Jesus issues a warning, the 12 were caught flat-footed. Here's what he says, verse 15. And he, that's Jesus, of course, was giving orders to them, the 12, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. The warning, like Jesus' tendency, was in metaphoric form. Leaven is active, it's a physical substance, and it changes the entire contents in which it's placed, mainly bread, which would cause it to rise, of course. Leaven in Scripture, however, most often implies some form of influence, generally evil influence and generally active influence. So Jesus is telling them to watch out for the effect or the influence that Pharisees and the Herodians, which was a party of people who supported Rome's oversight or rule of Israel. In this case, Jesus refers to 2 specific influences we just read. The 12 need to guard against that. Again, the influence of the Pharisees and the influence either of Herod Antipas, which I doubt. I think it was the Herodians, a party that supported Rome's rule of Israel. But the 12 evidently didn't get the drift. And look at verse 16. And they began to discover. They began to discuss with one another. I guess if you put discuss with one another into one word, you do get discover. And I'll start again on 8:16. And they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. Wasn't hard to see in a small boat. The Greek implies that the discussion focused on who to blame, the one who blew his responsibility. They're looking around saying, okay, who was supposed to make sure we got bread? But Jesus intervenes in the middle of that and asks a series of 5 questions, all likely demonstrations of his frustration at their spiritual dullness. Let's look at verses 17 and 18. And Jesus, aware of this, that they were starting to look around who to blame, having this argument among the 12 themselves, Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart?" There's a second question. "Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear?" And question number 5, "And do you not remember?" Remember what? We'll look at that in a minute. Again, the 5 questions. Why are you worrying about no bread? Don't you yet understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Don't you see? Don't you hear? Actually, there is another question aimed at taking them to some kind of solution of their dullness. Jesus goes on and said, "Don't you remember recent events, the 2 feedings? They've only been in the last month or 2. And then there are some questions that follow. Jesus speaking, "When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 12. And he goes on then in verse 20, "And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. It's like, you guys get it? And in verse 21, he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" What was he saying? Don't you realize that both of those massive feedings on the green prove that I have power? The power to feed you, the power to do miracles, but without any answers from the 12, verse 8:22, part A, they came to Bethsaida. Remember, it was only 7, 8, 10 miles over there, so it didn't take them long to get there. And these guys didn't come up with any answers to the questions that Christ gave, except the 2 that indicated they did remember having leftovers after Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 in one case and 4,000 in another case. Notice Jesus used these 2 massive feedings as 2 massive feedings. He said there were 2 feedings. How can you say there weren't? But how about, again, the question about influence, evil influence of sin? Or how about the evil influence of false teaching? Look at Matthew 16:12. Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Matthew does not go to the Herodians, but he went to the Sadducees. Now, I believe it's very likely that most of the Herodians were Sadducees, those who favored Rome's rule of Israel. Or how about the evil influence of hypocrisy? Look at Luke 12:1. Under these circumstances, after so many thousands of the multitude had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he, Jesus, began saying to his disciples, his 12, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So Luke names one of the evil influence of the Pharisees, and that is their hypocrisy. Herod Antipas, for example, if you want to assume that he may be the target of the word Herod, evil leader, you might choose to follow in his support. So if the Herod refers to Herod Antipas, Jesus essentially is asking them if they can stomach his leadership. The Herodians, though, those who supported Rome's rule of Israel, or in the case of the 12, some group whose influence, or why the 12? Why not us? What about in our case, the evil influence of some group whose influence directs our culture's notion of moral behavior? And do we have a number of evil influences of moral behavior, immoral behavior, actually? I want to go back to Mark 3:6, where Mark wrote earlier, we have seen this, and the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel with the Herodians against him, Jesus, as to how they might destroy him. So here you have the Pharisees who much hate the rule of Rome, cooperating, getting in cahoots with Herodians who like the rule of Rome. Two groups that should have nothing to do with each other, but they came together in opposition to Jesus. That's how strong the response to his work was. Note that when Jesus and the 12 had arrived at Bethsaida, Judea, there was still no positive evidence that the 12 finally got it. They indicated they hadn't got the point of Jesus' warning. And Mark never did tell us whether they ever did get the point. Matthew tells us a bit, but Mark just leaves it. They were dull when they reached shore, and he leaves them in that state. But Matthew tells us that 12 had at least begun to get the point that Jesus was making. Matthew 16:12. Then they, the 12, understood that he, Jesus, did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, read this a minute ago, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So he says they did begin to get the metaphoric connection. How do you think Jesus felt during this segment that we're looking at? On the boat, going back east, back into Gentile territory, and his 12 closest associates ain't got a clue. We had an earlier clue when some who were not in the inner circle failed to get it. But think how Jesus would have felt when those he'd been mentoring for 2 or 3 years didn't get it. Mark 3:5, backing up another verse from Mark, and after looking around at them, this was Pharisees in this case, and if he felt this way about Pharisees, think how he felt about his own people. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, one of the questions he asked the 12, he said to the man who had a withered hand, remember, stretch out your hand. The man stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Or how about Mark 6:51 for 52? And this is where he had just finished his stroll on the top of the sea, just walking on water. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped. And they were greatly astonished. Think about that. He gets in the boat, the wind quits. They don't know what to do with that. For they had not gained any insight, verse 52, from the incident of the loaves. That was from the feeding of the 5,000. But their heart was hardened. So back at the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus walked on the water, they still did not get the spiritual significance of what was seen. The Pharisees had failed to come to any spiritual understanding, where Jesus was concerned at least. So Jesus just walked away and quit trying to bring them to an understanding. He's through with them, folks. After they go back over to the other side of the Gentiles. But now the 12 must come to an understanding. Their dullness must come to an end where Jesus is concerned, because their time is coming soon. I hesitate to ask this, but could Jesus be at the same point with you and your state of spiritual sensitivity? Or with me? Just think about it. Peter encourages us to test ourselves, even beyond spiritual alertness, but all the way to the point of salvation. Look what Peter says in 2 Peter 1:10. Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you. Remember, your salvation depends first on God choosing you and then his calling you and you accept it. For as long as you practice these things, the things that Peter had laid out to them just prior to this verse, in the first 10 verses of 2 Peter, you will never stumble. So he said, if you want to be sure, you want to make certain about the fact that God has called you, he has chosen you, you have responded in faith and accepted Christ as your Savior, and if you go along doing the proper things that a Christian lifestyle should include, and only those things, you will never stumble. You can be certain of your salvation. But Peter says, never take your salvation for granted. Never assume that since you are saved, your lifestyle doesn't matter. Never believe that a life without ministry is God's choice for you. Are you in some form of ministry? Never believe there is no ministry that you are capable of doing to the glory of God. Don't say, I can't do anything. Never accept coasting on the road to glory. Never. Next session now, we're going to check the healing of a blind man in Gentile territory, a healing that involved more unusual sign language. Remember the last deaf mute that he healed? He did use sign languages and very strange to us looking action. Well, we're going to see it again, folks. Thank you for being here today. We look for you